In music, a tonic is a crucial part of a chord. It is the middle note that helps anchor down the highs and lows and creates a harmony. Here at the Tonic Accord, our goal is to be the tonic note in the political arena. We want to bring the right and left together for a discussion. A country needs a moderate and sensible center to bring the outer extremes together. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord. Today, I think we want to take a dive away from domestic policies. In the last couple weeks, we've talked about bailouts, deplatforming. Today, I kind of want to take a step back and discuss the U.S.'s humanitarian role in the world through the lens of our foreign and humanitarian aid programs, what those programs look like, how they are used, the money that goes into it, and then maybe we're going to touch on Venezuela and Hong Kong and how both of these may require humanitarian involvement. I think this is a relevant topic right now because the president is currently pushing to reduce foreign aid by up to 37%. Some officials in the administration are seeking to merge U.S. aid with the State Department. So let's dive in on this Tonic Accord. Drew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for asking, Alex. This is a really interesting topic, and I think it comes up every now and then, especially when you have like a crisis or a really newsworthy country in turmoil. A lot of these questions come up time and time again. Is what is the U.S.'s role as far as humanitarian aid or foreign aid in general? Because there's a little bit different. Humanitarian aid is foreign aid, but not all foreign aid is humanitarian. We'll get into that in a little bit. But, now we have a couple things going on in the world that brings up this conversation again. So for the last few years, Venezuela has been in a political and economic crisis, to say the least. And that has been a, kind of something everyone has been watching go down. And we wonder how can we help people or the countries around the people deal with that crisis. And then even more recently and more newsworthy right now is the current protest going in Hong Kong, where today we just had 1.7 million people marching in protest against the Hong Kong government and by extension the Chinese government and its policies regarding Hong Kong as kind of a separate but still involved part of the Chinese government. So it's an interesting topic. I think we first have to start by kind of defining what U.S. foreign aid is and a little bit of its history. I looked at the Council on Foreign Relations, and it goes into the role and the history of U.S. foreign aid. So originally, it started as a system basically during the Cold War to try and aid in national security and aid countries that were kind of pro-democracy and or to push countries towards pro-democracy and kind of beat the Soviet Union to the punch as far as who's more of an influence on the world, who's providing a better standard of living, and who will be the example to be the global superpower. So that's kind of where it originated from. And even though the Soviet Union has, of course, fallen, we've continued to use it in that similar sense. A lot of it being very military based. So we, as a country, we spend the most a dollar amount aid out of any of the other developed countries. But as far as individually GDP wise, we're not the top. We're like 22nd out of the top 28 who provide foreign aid as far as percentage of our GDP spent. So we do spend a lot dollar wise, but we're not spending it as much as others as far as a ratio. So we'll have to keep that in mind. And is there anything when you add about kind of the history of our foreign aid?
So I think not as much on history, but I think you touched on a really good point about the ratio to GDP and how much we spend compared to other nations. And I just kind of, I guess, wanted to highlight more about that just on the pure numbers of how important, because I truly believe that American humanitarian and foreign aid is probably one of our biggest soft power. Sometimes that translates into hard power as well, but I think a majority of the time, it's one of the biggest soft power initiatives in the world. And so there's there's basically three groups that are the most responsible, I would say, for our foreign aid programs internationally. There's the State Department's Bureau of Population and the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is USAID, right?
Right.
And I think it's an interesting fact that according to shareamerica.gov, the United States provided more than $8 billion in humanitarian assistance in the fiscal year of 2017 alone. And this made us leading the world's leader in humanitarian aid, most generous funder of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees frontline work, putting over 1.5 billion last year. And in Syria alone, we put in over $3.7 billion towards aid. Now, I'm not saying for military efforts, but for just the solo refugee aid in the region. And so, and even according to the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service, the CRS, talking about the broadest definition of aid, including military and security assistance, total spending was roughly 49 billion in 2016. This accounts for only 1.2% of the budget, like you were talking about. So we have such an important impact in the world, but at the same time, it's really not sucking a lot of finance out of our whole budget and economy. And that's why I have issues wondering why we're trying to step back right now.
Yeah, I mean, so in 2017 and 2018, Trump has called for cutting, U.S. foreign aid, like you said, by 37%, right? A third of it gone. And both times, Congress has said no, right? Congress is the one that decides the budget. They've said no to Trump. They want to keep it at kind of the stable levels we've had over the last 2-3 years. And yeah, I think you're right. I think it's something that, we obviously spend the more dollar amount than any other country, but it's not like we're breaking the bank of our own funds with U.S. foreign aid. I hear a lot of times, people criticize our foreign aid and say, why don't we take care of Americans first before we take care of others? I don't really think that's a good argument. I don't think that plays out because obviously you can do both at the same time. It's not like one has to be before the other. And two is it's not like we're using funds that would have gone to American programs to then go to foreign aid. This has been an established thing for half a century that we continue to, and it does ebb and flow back and forth. It's not like it's been an increasing behemoth of money. It ebbs and flows based on the crises and the world politics at the time. So, for example, in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union fell, we saw less of a need to compete with them in foreign aid. So it went down. Our foreign aid went down for a while. Then it went back up after 2001 with 9/11 because of our military operations in the Middle East. We wanted to provide funds for the people that were recently liberated under Saddam Hussein's regime. And as well as just try our best to stabilize the Middle East with the foreign aid. Now, obviously, I think anyone that's been looking at history will argue that we've destabilized much of the Middle East, but that's because of military interventions and many other factors. But it just goes to show that our foreign aid spending increases and decreases over with the times, but it's never been the kind of thing that's going to be breaking the bank. Now, I do want to look at where we do spend our foreign aid. So the U.S. gives out foreign aid to over 200 countries, but only a few of them are the ones receiving the amount. Like it's disproportionately going towards 5 or 6 countries. So let's take a look at that right now. As far as 2016 foreign aid spending, the most was spent on Iraq, which is over $5 billion, Afghanistan, which is also over $5 billion, Israel, which is over $3 billion, Egypt and Jordan, which are receiving a little over $1 billion each. And the majority of that money is in military aid. And Israel's $3.1 billion received from the U.S. is solely military aid. It's not humanitarian, which is, handing out food and medical supplies. It's giving them access to U.S. weapons, training programs, stuff like that. And so it's interesting when people think about U.S. aid is you kind of have the idea of guys coming down with trucks, handing out food to, impoverished villages and stuff like that. In reality, it's billions of dollars in military-style aid to Middle Eastern countries, which, is very different than what we see in the media as far as what we think of as U.S. foreign aid.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think it brings up to the big question of what is humanitarian aid. You know what I mean? Because I think for some people, it's yes, bringing medicine and food to an impoverished country, maybe that's riddled with disease or whatnot. But I think also it's obviously the U.S. government that's coining humanitarian aid and foreign aid and how we're using it. And I think it more does come down to what is in our best interest and what is helping us prosper. And so, unfortunately, the places that we have the most, I guess, focus on don't need as much medical aid. Well, I mean, they probably do, but military aid is more important, and so I think there's this fine line between, are we doing this out of humanitarian because we're trying to maintain the status quo of our systems, and I mean, I think I also want to touch back on a point you said a little bit earlier about, a lot of Americans say, well, why don't we put America first, or why don't we worry about our domestic problems? And Liz Schreier, I'm probably butchering that, the president of the U.S. Global Leadership Council, told CNN that these programs are in our interest. If we take ourselves off the playing field, we do it at our own peril. These are programs that we are using to advance our economic and our security interests, and I think it is really surprising that the administration is pulling back on what is less than 1% of our budget. So what I'm trying to say is that I think it's easy to kind of bundle humanitarian aid and military together, but either way, we're less trying to be the beneficiaries trying to help the world. I think instead we're just trying to secure our interests. And soft power can be easier than hard power sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that that's what this is for, and it's been pretty clear since the beginning, right? I mean, it's not like it's a secret. It's not like it's a conspiracy. It's definitely clear that it's like this is to promote U.S. interests, and it's in the U.S. interest to have good standing with a lot of countries that will, be more likely to promote American values and American interests than the opposite. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And going off what you said, you have Jim Mattis, who was President Trump's defense secretary. He also made a comment, in 2013, he wasn't the defense secretary at the time, but in 2013, he was a military commander, and he was telling Congress about talking about the State Department and U.S. aid. And he says, look, if you don't fully fund the State Department, then I'm going to need to buy more ammunition. And what he's saying is that it's these programs, like with foreign aid and the State Department and USAID, that allow us to not have to go into actual military conflicts. It is in our interest, and it's the interest of the military as well as just, in general, that we provide aid to these countries to not get into, worse stuff. Like in Afghanistan, a lot of that is security aid, training up local forces to be better at handling the Taliban and ISIS. That's all things that will allow us to hopefully one day soon not have such a strong military presence in the country. So yeah, I mean, it's obvious that it's in America's interests, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
No, I don't think so either. And I think that was well said about what Mattis said. I remember reading something a couple years ago. I'm not going to use specifics because I don't want to butcher it, but it was basically saying, I think it was the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was right after Trump was elected. We pulled out of a large majority of our UN peacekeeping force and our State Department that was there trying to work on getting their then dictator out of power. And pretty much the Trump administration just told everyone to pack up and come home. And violence just, exploded in the area. And it kind of makes you just go, well, no one wants war. Obviously the Trump administration in some aspects is pretty isolationist. And it goes, well, if we're pulling out our diplomats, then obviously we're going to have to drop bombs instead, and I think that we underestimate the importance of diplomacy and foreign aid.
Absolutely.
I mean, for the last 50 years, a lot of the most famous figureheads, other than the president, are usually Secretary of States. It's not the military all the time that comes in and saves the day. It's Secretary of State that's able to go to China or wherever not and open up a country, broker a peace, bring Israel and Palestine to the table, at least to talk. And I think when we stop talking, we start shooting again.
Absolutely.
And so it's dangerous. It's really dangerous.
Absolutely. And, providing aid, it's again and again, we have to give people a good image of what this aid is, right? It's not just guys coming out with trucks and boxes, but it's also not just training up militaries and stuff. A lot of it is long-term developmental aid, like maternity and family health, support for government healthcare systems, a lot of health-based programs in countries that can foster partnerships between nations and allow for a country to, develop and become maybe a greater economic partner. You have a lot of like there's short-term stuff, right? We provide aid for when the Southeast Asia gets hit by a monsoon or a hurricane. We provide aid. Earthquakes. We provide aid in those short-term crisis scenarios. But 42% of all of our U.S. aid is long-term development oriented, and I think you're right. I think when we do things like that, it can allow us to create partnerships that can avoid conflicts. So that the problem is, I hate to bring everything back to Trump, but Trump has said recently we should only be providing trade with people that like us and respect us. Let's be honest, our friends. And so it's like, well, how do you make friends, right? How do you make alliances is by doing things like this. So he has this idea that like we only want people, like we only give aid to countries that respect us. I understand that sentiment. Believe me, I do. I get that. You don't want to be providing aid to a country that's going to then turn around and use it against you. But sometimes we have to, be willing to lend a hand to countries that are maybe less than friendly, in the hopes that they do become friendly, in the hopes that we can make progress. Thankfully, Congress is definitely more in charge of where our U.S. foreign aid goes and how much we budget it, and they've been pretty consistent and pretty steadfast in making sure that we continue to provide aid.
I think that's a really good point, and I mean it's obviously not a great example because there's still mass violence in divided parts of the country, but I mean I actually think in some ways you can see the benefits of our foreign aid working with our military in Afghanistan, because as we are pulling troops out, and as yes there is a large spike still in violence in certain I think eastern parts of the country, we are seeing the U.S. government working hand in hand with the Afghan government, training Afghan troops, Afghan security forces. And I probably would not say that the Afghan government is our closest friend. We probably have very ideological differences on almost everything. But the thing is, we're two groups going to the table that are trying to work out the better benefit of the region, and
Right.
I think there's a lot of steps that need to be done in Afghanistan. And that's a whole other podcast episode. But
Yes, true.
I think that you're right. I mean, we need to work more with our, I don't even want to say foes, but just countries that we don't see eye to eye with.
Yes,
That's the more important ones.
that's how you get things done in this world. I mean, if it'd be easy to just be able to make policies with everyone agreeing with each other and everyone's friendly and happy, but it's like, come on, that's not how the world works. We have to lend a hand to people in order to get a hand back sometimes.
And I actually just wanted to actually, since we're talking about how it's sometimes linked with military aid and technology, I actually wanted to go to the other side really quick and actually talk about some of the benefits the Brookings Institute mentions that are some of the biggest positives actually in humanity. If you want to talk about true humanitarianism, health, poverty, etc., it's a few stats that are actually from the health-based programs that the U.S. aid and other groups have done. Malaria mortality has declined by nearly 50% since 2000, saving almost 7 million lives. The world is on the brink of eradicating polio, and 4 million fewer children die from diarrheal diseases each year than they did 3 decades ago. And a lot of people contribute that to Western and American foreign aid. And I'm okay with seeing that. I'm really
Absolutely.
okay with that.
Absolutely, and that right there is an argument for staying consistent with our aid, if not increasing it. There have been critics, right? There have been critics of it. Not just the critics that don't want government spending, but critics that say, a lot of the aid goes to corrupt governments or insulating people from political pressures. The Zambian-born economist Dambisa Moyo, he criticizes foreign aid, U.S. foreign aid, saying that despite more than $1 trillion in aid from multiple countries flowing into Africa in the past decades, real per capita income on the continent has not improved. Now, but his metric is real per capita income. While he's right, and that is sad. I would argue back that, well, sure, economically maybe not so much, but in the health area, like you just mentioned, malaria, polio, Bill Gates has argued that U.S. foreign aid has saved millions of lives, especially with the anti-HIV and AIDS campaigns in Africa. So there are critics, right? And there probably are issues. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, especially when you're dealing with dictators that can easily manipulate foreign aid for their own gain. But it doesn't. I don't think that's a good enough argument to say that we should stop doing it. Perhaps we just have to focus on areas where we see the benefits more clearly, like anti-HIV and AIDS and health campaigns.
No, I think that's a really good point, and I think that brings it down to because the political economy of a nation is going to be different than the foreign aid they receive for specific things. And so, so maybe malaria has declined by 50%. Yeah, you're right. The per capita income is still awful, but we need to separate those two things because, in my opinion, they're not really comparable.
Right.
Some forms of this medical aid are not meant to bolster the economy. They're meant to bring relief and education and technology to help everyone out of at least, third world illnesses that should be eradicated.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. His metric. Yeah. His metric is a little off the mark. As far as that Zambian economist. I mean, he's an economist. He's thinking economically, and I get that. But yeah, I mean, there's other issues, right? Basic standard of living and health that I think that U.S. foreign aid has drastically improved in many nations around the world. Great. So I think we should try to apply what we've just talked about to some current issues. Let me know if you want. Do you want to get started with Venezuela? Or you want to get started with Hong Kong?
I personally, I wouldn't mind if we dive into Venezuela first, just because it's older and I think it's been more dominant in the news.
Yes, over time. All right. Well, give us a rundown on what your thoughts are on what's happening recently in Venezuela.
I mean, basically, oh boy, since I think it was the late 90s, the United States and Venezuela have been just going in complete opposite directions. Hugo Chavez won after being locked up in prison and after a failed coup in the early 90s. He came into power and just ran a very socialist, very left wing platform, buying private industry, nationalizing oil, nationalizing health, nationalizing pretty much every industry possible. He got into bed with Cuba, Jamaica, Bolivia as well, and just pretty much did a crackdown on civil liberties, but also helped the poor rise themselves out of poverty to a certain extent. From day one, the United States was against Chavez, trying to sanction them, trying to get U.S. and their allies off of Venezuelan oil. I have to step back and also say that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and they have always suffered from a Dutch disease being a country that is dependent on one resource and the exploitation of that resource. And so Venezuela has relied heavily on their nationalized oil industry. But unfortunately, as time has gone on, oil prices have declined, renewables have grown. The U.S. has stopped buying larger and larger amounts of Venezuelan oil. And then Hugo Chavez dies in, I think, 2012, 2013.
Yeah.
And Nicolas Maduro takes over. And basically, this is my non-political correct view of it, is he was a stupider version of Hugo Chavez, who, kind of was sucking up to Hugo Chavez. He was the vice president, but he was a bus union man before this, no experience in actually running a country. And basically, he shut down free speech, created false elections, and since then has pretty much put the country into pure chaos, shooting student protesters, purging the government, getting rid of the Constitutional Assembly, and it's just completely become a S-word show. Yes.
It has. I mean, you have hyper inflation of the Venezuelan currency to the point where it's just worthless, right? There's like Farmville gold on Facebook is worth more than the Venezuelan dollar. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And you have people dying out of lack of supplies. I think someone said 1,500 Venezuelans are dying in hospitals because of just there's no supplies. The government is completely mismanaged. And so it's a full blown humanitarian crisis that has now been going on for you could say 5 years.
This is where it gets complicated, is because the United States has such an awful history in Latin America. It would be hard to name a country where the United States didn't have an intervention and some bad form of aid.
Right.
I mean, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, I talked about Pinochet and the Chilean coup. And after Allende, the president, was deposed and shot multiple times by Pinochet and his men, the U.S. long supported Pinochet and his crew. They've always been on the side of democracy, no matter what. And I think it's a very easy propaganda game for Maduro and his supporters to say is that, well, we're just trying to do this Bolivarian method, and the American capitalists are just trying to values and our own right to a government again.
Right. Yeah. So that leads us to the current situation where you have millions of Venezuelans. One, they're leaving the country. Right? There's a massive exodus from the country towards Brazil and Colombia. And now those countries are strained to take on migrants, just like similar to the Syrian crisis, the Syrian migrant crisis, where it's difficult to take on a massive amount of people with that are incredibly impoverished all at once. So it brings us to now where currently Venezuela is not open, right? It's not open. The U.S. does not provide aid to the actual country of Venezuela. The government is not taking U.S. aid at all. But we are currently giving aid to the surrounding nations in an attempt to help Venezuelan migrants. So Trump's head of U.S. aid is a guy named Mark Green. He's gone on to say that the United States is committed to helping Venezuelans leaving the Maduro regime. They call it a man-made crisis by the Maduro regime, just as like we talked about. And they're working with Colombia and Brazil and other Latin American and Caribbean countries to help the migrants and try and account for shortages of food and malnutrition. And it says here on the U.S. aid website that they've provided 223 billion. Oh no, sorry, scratch that. 256 million, and including 213 million in humanitarian assistance and approximately 43 million dollars in economic and development assistance in 2017. So that's the most recent number I have. So we are providing assistance and to help people host Venezuelans and find them urgently needed assistance. But none of that is going to Venezuela itself. And that's simply because the Venezuelan government doesn't want it. They don't want anything to do with, I mean, it's like it would be, quote unquote, like admitting defeat, right? And obviously you just mentioned how contentious our relationship is with Venezuela. Even though we used to buy oil from them, they don't want our aid and they don't want our assistance, and they don't even want to admit that there is a crisis.
I think you really clarified it well. I don't know, a little bit ago, talking about how we always think of aid as food and water and medicine. Venezuela's left, and unfortunately now certain members of the United States is left, certain members of Europe's left, have now said the U.S. are being imperialists again. There have been reports of us trying to smuggle guns and other technology across the border to help the right wing rebels. Well, I'm not going to say right wing, center right rebels, with Juan Guaido and the others. And so now there is this. I think, like you specified very well earlier, a lot of Americans don't know what aid entails, and
Yeah.
we are sending. There are weapons going across the border as well. And so if you're a skeptic of what the U.S. is doing, unfortunately, this is fuel to your fire. And I think it was members of the squad, Ulan Omar, I think Ocasio-Cortez as well. They both talked about how we shouldn't be involved in Venezuela because all we're trying to do is arm the opposition and cause another basically unstable state civil war, which, as you know, we've definitely been involved in over the last 40 years in the region. But I think we have to, this is at our doorstep. And I mean, yeah, you were talking about the refugee problem now. The United Nations in June estimated that more than 4 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That's 850 in Peru alone, and I think twice or even triple that number in Brazil or Colombia as well. And so this is not just a strain on Venezuela, it's a strain on the region. In Brazil, there are actually hate crimes and hate violence against Venezuelan immigrants, completely wrecking the whole region, And so I think this is the exact time where U.S. foreign aid needs to come in.
I agree. I agree. And, I don't think I would necessarily support like U.S. smuggling weapons across the border, but I do think we have to get involved. I would disagree with members of the squad, I guess they're called. We have to get involved. I mean, this is an incredibly huge humanitarian crisis, and to ignore it would be irresponsible, especially when it's something that is like so obviously a dictator that's clamping down against human rights with an oppressive regime. I mean, there's no other way to define it. It's not like, I mean, he's called threats to kill opposition. You said they've been shooting students protesting. I mean, it's pretty. A lot of things in this world are gray, but it's pretty black and white that Nicolas Maduro is an evil dictator. So I do think that the U.S. should get involved. I like this current way, right? That like look at Venezuela, the government itself is not going to take U.S. aid into its own borders. We send the aid to the surrounding countries, and I watched a video with U.S. aid head Mark Green where they were flying in medical supplies to Colombia, and then they were moving it from Colombia into Venezuela to get to the hospitals and stuff to provide care to the people of Venezuela. I like that a lot. It's like a non-violent way to basically say, screw you, Venezuela. Like, you're not going to help your people, well, we are. And that just makes the U.S. look better, right? So that whole propaganda that Maduro says, the U.S. is just an imperialist trying to, come in while the irons are hot. Like, no, man, we're the ones actually providing medical supplies to your people while you can't. So I'm all for it. I'm all for providing as much aid as possible to these people. It's obviously, I think it's just on a humanitarian level, it's the right thing to do. But then it's politically beneficial for the U.S. as well. It can lead to a better opinion of the U.S. in Latin America, which we desperately need based on our history. So I'm in agreement right now with Mark Green and who's Trump's appointee, the U.S. aid. I'm kind of behind what they're doing.
Unfortunately, I want to touch on the next part of what the administration has just done because I agree with you. I agree with Green and USAID, but The Economist reports on August 5th, Mr. Trump signed an executive order in effect to quarantine Venezuela in economic terms. And now, while I like what you're talking about, yes, this cross border initiative with neighboring countries, and remember, the Venezuelan government owns everything.
Right.
They've nationalized almost every industry. So this comes back to the sanctions issue for me, is that when you freeze a country's economic sector and whatnot, all you're doing is now you're going to hurt the people more.
Absolutely.
And I'm just concerned that now, if Trump's doing this, Maduro runs the state media. It's an easy way to say, well, look what our imperialists are doing. I like parts of this. I'm worried that, again, Trump and Mr. Bolton, that's John Bolton, out of their league and how to deal with this. I mean, Cuba survived sanctions, for the last 50, 60 years? And all it's done is make them super anti-American. And I don't think we should have another Cuba. And I
No.
think that's what Trump and Mr. Bolton want to do.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think just from the get-go, the problem is right there that it was an executive order, right? It's Trump and Bolton's idea, and it's not like the will of the people or Congress coming to an agreement. I mean, that first part, the fact that it's an executive order, is worrisome. And then you're right. I mean, if you're going to completely strangle the economic capabilities of a country, people are going to starve. I mean, you better be ready with a big ass humanitarian campaign to combat that and drop pamphlets around the country saying, we're the ones helping you guys. But if you're not going to do that, then you're right. Maduro will have the narrative. And again, we have to remember that too, that it's not like Venezuela's in crisis, but Maduro still has supporters. I mean, if he didn't have supporters, he still wouldn't be in power. But he has the military behind him. He has, I guess, what you would consider conservative in that country to conserve the old ways, right? The Hugo Chavez regime. You have traditionalists in that country that are very supportive of Maduro and want to keep the Chavez style regime. So he has supporters. You're right. There's a propaganda game to be played, and I think Trump's not playing it very well.
Trump called it Americanizing the crisis. That seems to be what Trump is doing, where he's turned this again. It's again back to his America first tactics. And I think the more that they do this, it's just going to make the situation worse for the average Venezuelan. So I think that it's just difficult how we actually get aid into the country. And like you've said, I think, that neighboring region cooperation is going to be probably the best way because the Venezuelan government is not going to talk to us.
No. No, they're never going to accept aid while it's still, I mean, they hate us, right? Even though they used to sell us a lot of oil, they hate us. And so, yeah, we're going to have to work with everyone around them. And it looks like that's what we're doing. But we have the executive branch calling for a third cut in U.S. aid, and like I just don't think that's the right call. I think Mark Green, who's the head of U.S. aid, he's on the right path, and we need to fund that even more. And so, yeah, I mean, as far as Venezuela goes, we'll just have to see. I mean, this has been playing out for years now. You do have the what we recognize as the interim president, Guaido. He's still around. He's been in danger, in and out of hiding and stuff. But we'll see how this plays out. But I definitely think the U.S. needs to play a role.
So, should we move on to the now more recent and news-heavy topic of Hong Kong?
Let's absolutely do it. Give us the rundown, Alex.
Okay. So, first off, Hong Kong is an international finance hub on China's southern coast. It was a British colony until 1997, when it was handed back to China under a policy known as One Country, Two Systems. Hong Kong, part of China, but let it keep many liberties denied by citizens on the mainland. This includes free speech, unrestricted internet access. For example, Twitter is available in Hong Kong, but not in the rest of mainland China. The territory has its own laws, system of government, and police force under a mini constitution known as the Basic Law. And so now, basically, what we are seeing is, since February, introduced a bill and linked to pro-Chinese lawmakers that would allow people accused of crimes in Hong Kong to be sent to places in which Hong Kong has no extradition treaty. This would include mainland China, where the courts are controlled by the Communist Party. So since then, I think we're in our 11th or 12th week now. Just consistent and growing protests. At first, it was by small groups, mainly of younger students, millennials, people that have, grown up in this multimedia landscape and have seen the benefits of democracy. And before we go on, I just wanted to put out my take of this really quick, is that I am very irritated that Trump has been so vague on condemning this growing hostile issues between the Chinese government and these Hong Kong protesters, because we have seen the American flag being waved during these protests. The United States is a beacon of freedom, open dialogue, and free speech. And these people are calling out for us. I really feel like they are calling out for help for us to condemn Xi Jinping's actions and for someone to condemn what the Chinese government is trying to do.
I mean, absolutely. I think I saw someone online posted, because I saw that same photo of the Hong Kong protesters waving American flags, and someone said, we need to always try and be the America they think we are, because obviously they look to America as this beacon of freedom and hope and and democracy, and like we need to always strive to that. If that's what they view us as, then that's what we need to be. And you're right. It's a shame that Trump, because he's obviously tied up in his talks with China in this trade war. He probably is taking the position that he doesn't want to piss off Xi Jinping because it'll affect his talks. But, that's not leadership. Leadership is like, hey, you can't clamp down on human rights. You can't be, taking people and extraditing people to mainland China to be disappeared and forgotten or whatever. And then that's ridiculous. And it's obvious that Hong Kong is protesting peacefully. I would not go as far as to say it's a chaotic event. If any of the chaos is coming, the chaos is coming from the police response. So, yeah, I'm on your side. It's a shame that Trump has not taken a strong stance. Whereas, where you look at Congress, or Republicans and Democrats have been very vocal in support of the protesters. Republican Senator Ted Cruz has said, if Xi Jinping doesn't stop eroding Hong Kong's sovereignty and halt attacks on protesters, the U.S. must consider applying the same policy to Hong Kong as we did when banning things after Tiananmen Square. So obviously, there's a bipartisan voice here that's in support of the protesters.
Yeah, I completely agree, and unfortunately, things are starting to turn for the worst. I mean, since June 12th, when police officers used pepper spray, batons, and more than 150 canisters of tear gas, things have gotten more violent. And I mean, I want to focus our attention for a minute on Carrie Lam. She's the Beijing appointed, I guess, is it President Drew? Do you know? I think President of Hong Kong, or I don't know,
Let's
a
find
member of
out.
Hong Kong.
The chief executive, Carrie Lam.
Okay, so Carrie Lam, the chief executive, she's a pretty much a Beijing plant. And I'm worried because she has refused to make further concessions since suspending the original bill. So I do want to, just for defense sake for her, she has in some ways listened to protesters and has moved a little bit back on this original bill. But her rhetoric is what worries me. She said they want to topple Hong Kong, to destroy the livelihoods that 7 million people cherish. She said the city is on the verge of a very dangerous situation. What the hell does that mean?
Yeah, topple Hong Kong. Let's be real. I mean, these are students at the universities and regular people. I mean, it's not. It doesn't seem like it's a kind of burn down the system and rebuild. It's more of a, can we just like preserve the somewhat democracy we have? Yeah, I mean, her rhetoric is inflammatory because I don't see a violent revolution coming from the side of the protesters. I see people moving out of the way for ambulances during the protest and letting ambulances go through and then continuing the protest once the ambulances have gone. That to me is the epitome of a peaceful protest.
Yeah, that's very well said, and it's just I'm worried because you're right. I don't see the protesters causing any violence. First off, they don't even have the means to. I don't think they want to either. And I mean, second off, I mean the Chinese government's, the Chinese military, they're close and waiting. I mean, what's that breaking point? And then I mean today, see, I think there was a false Twitter account that came. The Washington Post reports that Monday it has suspended more than 200,000 accounts that it believes were part of a Chinese government influence campaign targeting the protest movement in Hong Kong. Twitter traced the Hong Kong campaign to two fake Chinese and English Twitter accounts that pretended to be news organizations based in Hong Kong. So now you have the Chinese government and these fake accounts just inciting more and more division. And I mean, I don't think this would ever be like the Tiananmen Square incident in the 90s, but I mean, to me, there is going to be a tipping point, and I would not be surprised if there was violence.
Yeah, I mean, I like China's communist and they had the one party rule and they want to keep it that way. I don't think they want any of this attitude and the spread of these protests to get into mainland China. So, obviously they're going to do their whole media spin super heavy. But you're right that they won't be able to recreate a Tiananmen Square just because of the technology today. I mean, you wouldn't be able to run over a street full of people with tanks because everyone would be live streaming it and putting it on their phone and the world would know. I mean, you could argue the world knows about Tiananmen Square, but they suppress that information in China vehemently. So I don't think they would be able to do that if they did some kind of massacre in Hong Kong. Thankfully, we won't get another Tiananmen Square there. But I could still see violence. I mean, throwing tear gas at people is violence, right? It's causing harm to innocent civilians. So there is violence, and it's been done by Hong Kong riot police. Yeah, I do think that it's just going to get worse before it gets better. But hopefully the U.S. can do something to make it better. I think it's a tricky political situation, but I do think we have a responsibility to send some aid to Hong Kong, especially if this shutdown of the city basically lasts a long time. Basic functions of a city, like providing food and basic services, might start to deteriorate. I think it's the U.S.'s responsibility to pick up that slack in support of democratic protests, to provide food or to provide medical supplies if you start to see a shortage happening in the isolated island.
It is our responsibility. And I mean, a staggering stat is that the U.S. has had a consulate in Hong Kong for 175 years. You can't say that about a lot of places.
Right.
And it's a model for a lot of Asia to follow. But where I'm confused, I don't really have a solid answer on this, is do we send direct physical aid, or does our voice speak louder? Should this Mike Pompeo, for example, or going to Hong Kong and demanding that this stops? Trump should be demanding that this stops. I don't know how much foreign physical aid will do for this, because I think it's less the issue of infrastructure, health issues, starvation. It's more a fact of political dialogue and rhetoric, you know?
I think that's right. I think in this scenario, Hong Kong is not like a Venezuela. Like the people in Hong Kong are pretty wealthy compared to other countries. They have the infrastructure there. You're right. You're right. I think short term it has to be a diplomatic show. I mean, it has to be, we have to show like, hey, we're behind the Hong Kong, we're behind the protesters, we're behind democracy. We always have been, and we always will. And perhaps we need to take that into the trade talks room, right? Everything's linked together. It seems like Trump doesn't want to do that, but I think that'd be a perfect place to do it. Like, look, if we're gonna have a good faith trade partnership with China, then you need to have good faith in protecting the human rights of the people in Hong Kong, like you have before, like you've agreed to the two states, the two state kind of situation, or two systems, so to speak. So I think you're right. I think you're right for the short term that. But if it does turn into a long term thing, it could turn bad. It could turn to providing food quickly. I mean, if you have 1.7 million people protesting on a small island, that could lead to infrastructural problems. So, but I think we're in agreement though that the U.S. needs to take a stance, and we need to take a stance in on the side of pro democracy and pro freedom.
Yeah, very well said. And I mean, I think the big issue, the elephant in the room of this, is that the Trump administration wants to combine USAID and the Department of State. And the problem is that both of these could have a very valuable role, but I don't think USAID and the Department of the State are the same thing. They shouldn't
No.
be used as the same agency. I mean, USAID, I think, is more of a physical foreign aid. They are boots on the ground foreign aid, and the State Department is not that. They are drafting discussion amongst other world leaders. There's just no way we could combine those. It's horrifying to me, actually.
Yeah, there's a lot of consolidation going on, and I think a lot of the consolidation in foreign aid is just an excuse to basically defund a lot of it. So we'll see how that plays out. But in general, though, I think U.S. foreign aid is a good thing. It is in America's interest, and it doesn't conflict with the aid we provide to our own citizens. In fact, if it does anything to our own citizens, it helps them because we foster a good, beneficial relationships with nations around the world that will eventually come back and help us. Anything you wanted to add before we wrap this episode up, my friend?
Oh, I mean, I think we're getting into an interesting part of this year. Kind of the last third of what's the year, 2019. um, I think we have recession talks. We have an escalating trade war. It looks like ISIS and the Taliban are again on the offensive. And I know these all sound like separate little pieces. I think the Hong Kong crisis and the trade wars are somewhat linked because China is on the defensive. They don't like you said, this quasi-democratic state within their own effing country.
Yeah.
And we don't play hardball with China in some way anything good is going to come out of Hong Kong either. And so I think we need to really take a step back, if I was in the Trump administration especially, and say, what do we want? What do we want out of this world right now? Because all we're seeing is chaos and division, small crises. And I always think that right now is a similar time to kind of the onset of World War I, when you have all these small conflicts that eventually escalate. I think we really need to take a step back, not just the United States, but China, Japan, Korea, the West, back and think about what do we really want moving forward.
Interesting take. Well, guys out there listening, guys and gals out there listening, stay tuned. Like Alex mentions, there's a lot of interesting things coming up. We're still going to be following the elections in the times to come. Iowa is in February, which is not that long away. And we will be covering it all. And we'll be going in depth into various topics, as well as some episodes taking back and looking at some more, basic current news and general things going on. So stay tuned for all that. Again, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Podbean. And please give us your feedback. We want to hear what you think. Your opinions matter. Give us feedback on the podcast itself, or give us your thoughts on the topics we discuss. We want to hear it all, and we would love to hear from you guys. With that, have a great week, and we'll catch you next time.